Okay, so good morning and welcome to another edition of Research Data Management Workshop Series. I hope you all remember to turn back your clocks, and it's still at 10 o'clock here. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I'd just like to give you a quick update. On November the 14th, we'll have Graham McReady, who's going to speak on Indigenous health data and research from ICIS, and he's at ICIS Central. And then on the 21st, we'll have Doug Manuel from Ottawa, speaking on the benefits of open data for public health. Just a reminder, we would really like to encourage you to become a data champion. And if you want to know more about the Ottawa Data Champions program and how to become a data champion, please look at this URL, and we'd be delighted to speak to you. This morning, we have the pleasure of Dr. Mary Anderlich Majumder, who's going to speak to us on participants' perspectives and evolution of genomic data sharing policies. Welcome to you, Mary, and thank you so much for your time. And I've just unloaded my slides, so you can drop in yours.
Fantastic. So this worked in practice. I know those are famous last words, but let's see if I can get mine up there. All right, do you see everything you're supposed to and nothing that you're not supposed to? Just one slide with the title. Yeah?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. So I'm delighted to be here and there with you virtually to have a conversation about participants' perspectives and the evolution of genomic data sharing policies. I have about 40 minutes of content, so we should have plenty of time at the end for question and answer. In the spirit of a workshop, I hope that you will have lots of questions, and not only questions, but a willingness to share your own experience if you've done research in this area, any findings from your research. I'm going to be a bit parochial. We're just talking about, the US has a baseball tournament, we call it the World Series. I'm going to focus mostly on findings from studies in the US, but I'll also bring in quite a bit of data from a recent international survey and would love to learn more about the Canadian context. So I do receive some support from the US National Cancer Institute, but the views I will express are entirely my own. And here's a quick overview. I am going to flip the order suggested by the title and start out with genomic data sharing policies, and then turn to participant perspectives, just a sampling. This isn't, I don't purport to have a comprehensive overview, but to give you a sense of some of the findings in all these different areas, as well as some of the sources of diversity. And I will try at a few points to connect the perspectives back to the policy. So in terms of policy evolution, I pulled together this timeline, which is very selective, but even so, reviewing it over the weekend, I realized I could spend the whole 40 minutes laboriously going through each of these items, and that would be a pretty boring way to spend 40 minutes. So I'm going to touch on a few highlights and try to give you my own sense of the general trends. I thought a good place to begin on the policy side would be with the Bermuda Principles, which were not exclusive to the National Institutes of Health in the US, since the Human Genome Project was an international project, but certainly applied there. And if they're not familiar, they were put on a whiteboard by Sir John Sulston, and we use the name Sulston for one of our projects devoted to data sharing with the permission of his widow. But one of the chief principles was that there would be a daily deposit of the sequence data generated to the internet. And I think that's important because it was a tremendous commitment to open science. It also marks a point at which two meanings of open would hang together. And I think one of the trends I want to flag is that they're going to come apart over time. But there's open in the sense of non-proprietary. When public funding is being used, then it's inappropriate to treat biospecimens or data as an exclusive asset of an individual or an institution to be exploited for their individual or institutional gain. So that sense of open as non-proprietary is certainly there with the Bermuda Principles. And one of the points of putting the data in the public domain was to prevent patenting of the sequence information, which would have been possible at that time. And then the other sense of openness is in kind of the phrase open access. It means unrestricted, so that anybody anywhere can access the data. And again, that was true in the case of the Bermuda Principles because the data was being deposited to the internet in an unrestricted manner. So I want to connect the policies to events in the outside world. There's not always a direct relationship. I'll touch on a few later, but I wanted to start events with a development that was very meaningful to me personally in terms of my research career in this area. So I had the good fortune to be an investigator on a research project led by Mark Rothstein in the United States and Bartha Knoppers in Canada. And this is sort of at the dawn of biobanks, including the idea of sort of digital, or I think we called them cyber banks. Exploring the different forms they might take, we crossed paths with some parents of children who were affected by serious conditions, autism and PXE, which is a recessive genetic disease that affects connective tissue and has other impacts. And so we engaged with Jonathan Shaystack and Portia Iverson around autism and Sharon and Pat Terry around PXE. And the story they told was one of extreme frustration with researchers who were unwilling to share their data. In essence, were hoarding their data for that individual or institutional benefit to get publications, maybe patents, certainly research grants. And yet the effect was to slow the advance of the science. And so out of this frustration, both these couples were involved in founding their own biobanks to accelerate research. And now they've been absorbed in some larger projects, but I've always been skeptical of a narrative that you'll sometimes hear where scientists or certain components of the scientific community are pushing for open science, for data sharing, and the patients are digging in and citing privacy and other concerns to resist that development, because I think it's a more complex story. So moving forward, in the US, we have the case of the Havasupai tribe, which eventually leads to a lawsuit in 2004. The tribe had been interested in some work on diabetes, which was a health concern for them. That actually didn't pan out, but without their knowledge, their samples were then used for a variety of other studies, including studies of inbreeding, migration patterns, which were at odds of the tribe's own beliefs about how they came to their land, and schizophrenia. And so they ended up suing. That case was eventually settled. It didn't have an immediate impact, I would say, in terms of policy, but it's now one of our main case studies when we think about research abuses. And it certainly had an effect down the road. Oh, and in terms of decoding this for my own benefit, like green and for yours, green is sort of go full speed ahead on data sharing. Red is something that is sort of a stopping point, or at least a moment for reflection. And then, because I didn't think yellow would show up very well, I used brown for kind of proceed, maybe even expand data sharing, but also with significant cautions. So we have the Havasupai case. Before that, in 2002, the Navajo Nation instituted a moratorium on genetic research. So it was a parallel development, but driven by similar concerns. Again, I don't think it had an immediate impact, but I think it's important to mark that point. And in fact, what's going on in policy world at that time is that we have an expansion from the Human Genome Project to genome-wide association studies of policies of open science and putting de-identified data out in pretty unrestricted access formats. And then Homer and colleagues published a study showing that it's possible to re-identify individuals even in de-identified, ostensibly de-identified pooled data. And the response to this is a pendulum swing rather dramatic in the other direction. So a lot of data is swept into controlled access at this point, included genomic summary results, which I'm not my science is ELSI science, but this would include things like allele counts and frequencies. And it can be, from what I understand, very valuable, but that was swept into controlled access out of concern about re-identification. In 2014, the NIH issues a genomic data sharing policy, which again is moving data sharing commitments to a wider group of research grants, but includes significant cautions related to these privacy and re-identification concerns, and also has an interesting consent feature, which I'll cover in relation to perspectives. But you have some events out in the world that are pushing data sharing forward, including the creation of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, our own precision medicine initiative, other reasons for concern, not specific to research, but just about data being misused or being vulnerable. In policy world, what's going on at this time is there's recognition that perhaps that pendulum toward restricted access went a little too far. And I think it's in 2018, there's a decision to move most genomic summary results back to unrestricted access. And then we get to the present day where in our country, it's a pretty major development. There's an NIH-wide data management and sharing policy that will go into effect in January of next year. So it marks an expansion, although I think it's important to recognize it doesn't require data sharing, or at least sharing of any particular data, but it does require for all NIH-funded research grants that there be submission of a data sharing plan. But this is brown or yellow and not green because there are some significant cautions. There's just in September of this year, there was a release of 2 supplemental documents, one related to privacy protections for human research subject or human research participant data, and another related to responsible management and sharing of American Indian and Alaska Native participant data. And so that's where I think finally the Havasupai case and the other concerns from Indigenous groups are being taken seriously in policy. So at that point, we can come back to discuss anything that you might want to explore further, but I am going to move on to the participant perspectives. And just a little bridge is my aha moment, where I realized that some of the diversity that we see in perspectives can be explained by the diversity of the populations or subpopulations that we're surveying or focus grouping or interviewing or engaging through deliberative democracy. And so some studies explore the perspectives of the general public. Some look at patients or specific groups affected by illness. but not everyone identifies as a patient or chooses to access the healthcare system. And in the US, and I hope we understand that it's different in Canada, there are also large numbers of people who are unable to access healthcare when they need it. And so if our mode of ascertaining perspectives is to engage with people who have access to healthcare, who are using healthcare, we are going to get, I don't want to necessarily say a biased, but a viewpoint that reflects the availability of that access and the attention that brings. And then there are people who have serious health conditions and no good treatment options. So that puts me in mind of the Terrys and the Shaystack-Iversons. So either the patients or the family members who are looking for options, have a distinctive standpoint. Research participants, again, if you're inside the research enterprise, whether that's as somebody who's contributed to a biobank or somebody who is participating in a clinical trial or somebody who's a healthy control, that in itself may give you a perspective that's different from those who are not enrolled or have not enrolled in research. And then finally, there are groups with distinctive concerns, such as Indigenous communities. And this is not intended to be proportional to the size of these groups in any particular population. It just was my way of fitting it in with all the right overlaps. But I will try to flag as I go along through the research literature or the empirical literature concerning participant perspectives, which group we're talking about or groups. So, and this is a sampling again, not purporting to be comprehensive. In terms of looking at consent and willingness to share, I am greatly aided by 2016 systematic literature review carried out by Nana Garrison and colleagues. It sort of sets the floor. So this is covers an eclectic set of studies. So some of those population differences, some of this is public, some of it is biobank participants, some of it is people with cancer, and it cuts across qualitative and quantitative research studies. But there is a nice summary that I think does capture the overall gestalt in relation to consent and willingness to participate. So they write that the majority often express support for broad consent when that was the only choice offered. So when people are asked, would this be acceptable? Majorities would generally find it acceptable, but only a minority of respondents favored broad consent, had that as their preference, when other options such as tiered or study by study consent were offered. Willingness to give broad consent increased if data were described as de-identified. And then in terms of recipients of data, individuals were generally willing for data or biospecimens to be shared with academic researchers, less willing in terms of federal databases, or sometimes these questions are framed in terms of sharing with the government. You see a decrease in support and then a further decrease in the case of commercial enterprises or for-profit enterprises. And just to fill out the picture a bit, this is the largest study captured by that systematic literature review. It was looking at the perspective of the general public in the United States, anticipating creation of what eventually becomes the All of Us research program. But in the study, which involved over 4,600 adults, 60% said they would participate in a biobank if asked at national scale. In terms of consent preferences, nearly half preferred to give permission once for research approved by an oversight panel, but a slightly smaller but still very significant block wanted to give study by study permission, and then 10% preferred to select categories of research. 81% agreed that being asked for consent for studies would make them feel respected and involved. So I don't know if you can see this, it might be pretty tiny and I'm not going to dwell on it, but this is a table. I've just shown you excerpts from the table. And what it establishes is that if you look at demographic factors like income, education, and racial or ethnic group, people in the most privileged or least vulnerable group were generally more supportive or more willing to share than those who were the least privileged and most vulnerable in social terms. So that was true for income, education, and race or ethnic group, between like a 5 and 10 percentage point difference in general. But if you look across categories of recipients, that pattern holds where there's the most support for sharing with academic researchers, and then it's kind of strange, government-funded researchers. A lot of academics in the US are government-funded, but with that word government in there, support falls off, and then falls off further for pharmaceutical company researchers. Not very many people enthusiastic about even de-identified information just simply being put out on the internet, available to anyone. So to show one of those links between perspectives and policies, I'm going to return to the NIH genomic data sharing policy. So it's expanding the commitment to data sharing for NIH-funded genomic research, but there's this important requirement of consent for research, even if specimens or cell lines are de-identified. And what makes this significant is that in general research regulations in the US and what we call the common rule, de-identification is generally your ticket out of the regulations and requirements, including those regarding consent. And so NIH here saying, even in the case of de-identified data, we, through this policy, are going to impose an additional consent requirement. They do say it can be broad consent, and there is an exception for compelling scientific reasons. And this is the rationale for that consent requirement. So they talk about re-identification risk, and they talk about what's respectful in general. But the last bit here I have underlined and bolded, that's my emphasis. They say it's increasingly clear that participants expect to be asked for their permission to use and share their de-identified specimens for research. And they cite to a number of articles, but I think the only one that is a primary research study is that Kaufman et al. Study, which is cited to support this. So they're paying attention to participant perspectives and weighing them in creating policy. So all the other data I'm going to talk about now beyond the Kaufman study postdates that systematic literature review. This was a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, so kind of splashy. And instead of the general public, it looked at the perspectives of clinical trial participants, either people who were currently or had in the past participated in a range of clinical trials. And they found that 93% were very or somewhat likely to allow their data to be shared with academic scientists. That dropped to 82% for scientists in for-profit companies. There's also some interesting research findings in the area of benefits and concerns. And I apologize if this is a little blurry, it's looking blurry to me, but the message here is that clinical trial participants endorsed a wide variety of benefits that they saw flowing from data sharing, including maximizing the scientific benefit of people's participation in clinical trials, addressing rare disease contexts where combining data is really important given the small numbers, and then helping patients and groups of patients learn more about the health problems that affect them on down. In the area of concerns, this was to me somewhat surprising. At the very top, if you combine very concerned and somewhat concerned, it wasn't about like their personal situation. Again, this was a group that was largely very pro data sharing, but they worried that it could be harder to get other people to agree to be in clinical trials, knowing their data would be shared. And then the other two in the top three were concerns about use of information for marketing purposes and that information might be stolen. So now back to the general public, but on a global stage. So the Your DNA, Your Say survey was developed and fielded and analyzed by a group within the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And there have been a series of publications related to this. I think this was the first to report data that I'm showing right here that came out in 2020. Very interesting. So first they asked about willingness to donate DNA and medical information. And they identified 3 different possible recipients: doctors, nonprofit researchers, and for-profit researchers. And here I'm highlighting the data for Canada and the US. Pretty similar. I think Canada is just a little bit lower, and there's a bigger drop-off between nonprofit and for-profit researchers. But as in many countries, there are a lot of people who are either unwilling to donate or unsure about donating DNA and medical information. And one of the associations that they track is to familiarity with genetics. So people who are familiar with genetics and genetic testing tended to be more supportive, more willing to donate. They also looked at the connection or possible connection to genetic exceptionalism, the view that DNA and genetic information is different from other and more sensitive than other kinds of medical information. And as you can see here, Canada and the US aren't wildly different, although the US has more people who are genetic exceptionalists. And intuitively, you might think that if you think DNA is exceptional, you might be more reluctant to share DNA information. But in fact, there was no association in the sense of a positive relationship between endorsing the proposition that DNA is different and being decreased willingness to donate data. In fact, the relationship was either neutral or being a genetic exceptionalist was positively associated with willingness to donate. And the positive association existed for both Canada and the US. So another factor that comes up frequently is the relationship between willingness to donate and trust, or the importance of trust. And so that was something else examined in the Your DNA, Your Say study. So this is data on the percentage that said they trusted multiple individuals or organizations. And as far as I can tell, virtually identical between Canada and the US here. And people who were more trusting were also more willing to donate. So that's not surprising. And it gives rise to the thought that, well, maybe we can do something or take some strategies or measures that will increase trust. So there was this question about what information would help you to trust the people asking you to donate DNA information and or medical information. And you can see people endorsed a wide variety of kinds of information. In some cases, the information's tied to an actual structure of the effort. So the top, and I think this was true across most, if not all countries, was information about who will benefit. That was seen as very important in nurturing trust. And then things like the option to withdraw data, the ability to opt out of access by others, and access to your own DNA or medical data were all endorsed. And I'll return to return of results because that's an important theme across a number of studies. The only thing people didn't seem to care about very much was biographies of researchers. That was below 25%. There's also this idea, and I think this is confirmed by multiple studies, that if you are engaged with an entity that you trust, let's say in your provision of your healthcare, and there's a connection there to leverage to data sharing, that will tend to make people more willing to share. And so this is a study, not of the public, but of biobank participants and their attitudes toward data sharing and privacy, and also brings in a little bit of qualitative research, which is the kind of research that I tend to do. But there are 2 places in just this overview of themes where trust is really front and center. And one is people not being too concerned about security because not because they don't care about security, but because they have trust in the reputation here of a university that was the sponsor for the biobank, not to do anything to jeopardize its reputation and to have a good reputation. And then they also assumed, whether or not this was true, that sharing would be contained to other entities that were vetted and trustworthy. So they thought the university would not share with entities that might be careless or lead to harm. Okay, so return of results. I've always thought this is one of the most striking graphs I've seen in a research paper. So this is, again, the Kaufman study that I touched on earlier. And part of that survey included giving people different scenarios for how things could be structured, including with respect to compensation and return of research results. And what you can see, I hope, is that, remember, the overall willingness to participate was 60%. But if you look at the group of people who said they were very concerned about privacy, that's the yellow dot. Only 47% said they would be willing to participate with modest compensation of $50 and no research results. But that jumped to 58% either with the promise of return of research results, in addition to that modest compensation, or an increase in the compensation without research results. And then you could get all the way to 69% for that very concerned group with a combination of enhanced compensation and research results. Still hypothetical, but I think very powerful and definitely shaped the approach in terms of return of results for the All of Us research program. I like this study from Consuelo Wilkins and colleagues because it takes apart what it might mean to return results. And it also embeds return of results within a broader concept of return of value, which they favor, and I think there are good reasons for favoring that way of thinking about things. So that what's the portfolio of ways that we're returning value, and what do specific groups find most meaningful out of everything that we could do. So in their survey, and although the title of this article is research participants, I checked, it's a survey with the public, so people who could participate in research. The top two were how I may respond to medications based on my genetics, so pharmacogenetic information, and how my genetics affect my risk of getting a medical condition. Interestingly, so this was kind of a check all that apply exercise, and how to connect with others like me in the study was at the bottom. That when they had a forced choice exercise where the respondents had to pick one, for the high school or less group, how to connect with others like me in the study, it actually rose to the top. So a reminder that also different subgroups of people may value different things, again, when you're putting together a portfolio. Finally, there was a question in the Your DNA, Your Say survey about the difference being offered a DNA readout would make in terms of decisions to donate. And this came out kind of blurry, but the takeaway is that the United States is an outlier in terms of the amount of importance people placed on return of results, to the point of being wholly influenced by that. But across countries, people certainly valued that, and it's reflected in what they said they would do. I think the Russian Federation was the only country that had the same profile as the United States on this question. So governance, a favorite topic for me and a favorite study for me. I was happy to participate in some of the sessions reported here. So this was a study that we did using deliberative engagement methods, specifically a citizens panel in 3 communities across the United States. And of course, it's not representative, but we did try to recruit a diverse population and meet a threshold of at least 25% of participants identifying as having a chronic disease. And we use the concept of medical information commons to capture this kind of large scale data resource, something like All of Us, which we used a version of that in a case study that was presented to the participants. So their hopes and concerns, in the interest of time, I'm going to pass by this without really dwelling, but it's very similar themes to the other themes that I've already touched on, found through surveys and other methods of eliciting perspectives. But we spent a lot of time on governance. And so this is where I wanted to spend at least a minute or two. So we presented the participants in the citizen advisory panels. Later on, we changed the word citizen suddenly around that time. This was in 2017, became fraught. And so we referred to them as community advisory panels. But I mean, yeah. We gave them a range of options for integrating the voice of the participants in the commons in governance, from no involvement to providing feedback through surveys to having a community advisory board. And in my experience, this is probably the go-to for most biobanks, is to have a community advisory board, to having participants on the governing board that makes decisions, to participants running the whole show with expert input as needed. And for our exercise across the sites, the majority selected number 4. They wanted informed representatives of the participant community actually engaged, actually at the table when decisions were being made. But they also wanted other forms of capturing perspectives beyond that. So this wouldn't be the exclusive means of getting participant input. So my last bit of data concerns Indigenous groups, some recent publications capturing perspectives. And your next in the series, your next workshop sounds fascinating. And so I don't think in any way this is going to steal the show, because I just have limited data, but I still think it's very interesting and important. So I mentioned that in 2002, the Navajo Nation in the US put in place a moratorium on genetic research. And so this is a survey led by Katrina Claw and colleagues. And they asked members of the Navajo Nation a number of questions, including whether that moratorium should be lifted. And the biggest block said not sure. And there are places for comment, and I think these are illuminating. A number of the comments were just about the need for more information. People weren't always aware that this moratorium even existed, which is not surprising. People have to deal with a lot, and genetic research may not be top of mind, or limits on genetic research. The other comment, I think, reflects the view of people who were knowledgeable, but had it's more gray than yes and no sort of perspective. So this person said it isn't a simple question of yes or no. The Navajo Nation and its members need to have the proper staff, resources, policies, procedures, and infrastructure in place to exercise appropriate oversight and to protect our people. In terms of what would be needed, these were the very important items. Those data sharing protections needed to be in place, so that was widely recognized. There needed to be a clear plan for research benefits to accrue to the Native tribe itself, and then they emphasized the importance of inclusion of cultural knowledge. And this is a different kind of study. So the Strong Heart study is the largest epidemiological study in the US focused on the Native population. And there is interest among some researchers in sharing that data more widely. And it now goes beyond cardiovascular disease. And so the plan they developed was to go to representatives of some of the tribes involved in the Strong Heart study, and with them to plan community-based participatory research project, which would then assess tribal perspectives on privacy and health data sharing, and then loop back to members of the groups in terms of analyzing that data. And so they went to this initial group with a number of questions, and one of them was just, who should we talk to? And the answer was basically everyone. They named some individuals across a number of roles, and they also named a large number of groups, including elders and wisdom keepers, youth and their guardians on the other end of the life journey, people involved in general governance, people on the IRB, school staff, people involved in healthcare and public health, and so on. So they wanted a very inclusive process, and they wanted both formal and informal interactions. In terms of the how, they wanted people to be approached both individually and together. And I think this is a good point to note too, that there was a very communal ethos. And so people didn't think in individualistic ways in general. But that being said, they recognized that some of the community members might be shy about speaking up in groups. And so they wanted them to be, have that opportunity to be consulted individually. They wanted contextual information to be provided, and they didn't want a one-off. They wanted more than one encounter, giving people extra chances to express their perspectives. And so I just love this study, and it gave me the same feeling that I got recently. I had the pleasure to be in Canada, in Vancouver, and listen to a presentation on some of the work being done in relation to the Silent Genomes Project. And it's this wonderfully rich, developing conversation over time, leading to eventually, hopefully that trust being built, getting to some specific issues, but always having that cultural context to guide. And yet when I walk away, I think how different this is from how, even in the area of ethical, legal, and social implications research, from how our funding works and how we typically do research projects. So we typically have 3 or 4 years. And so by year 2, we want to be wrapping up our data collection, so we have time to analyze our data. And the time frame for this kind of work with the community is just completely different. And so I think it's very important to see whether that feeds back, not just we need to do the work, but do we understand what's needed to do this work well? In the case of the US, we have seen more and more attention to the care principles put out by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And in that supplemental information document related to the NIH's data management and sharing policy, there is a reference to the care principles as well as the FAIR principles. So I was like, yes, when I read that. I understand that, I don't know if it's equivalent, but maybe a rough analogy in the case of Canada would be the OCAP principles. And again, have seen these referenced in the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy. Although just trying to do a little background reading, it looked as if maybe that only happened due to the public consultation process, and that initially these only appeared in an FAQ. And so integrating them in the policy itself required some nudging and some sharing of perspectives. So I'm at the 40-minute mark, and I think I'm doing pretty well. I have a summary, and again, this is my particular slant on things. I would suggest that data hoarding, just refusing to share data, full stop, violates the expectations and wishes of many participants, however you define participants, that most would want to be asked about data sharing for reasons of respect, and they prefer to be given choices, and certainly clear evidence of reservations about sharing with for-profits and governments. And I didn't discuss, we've also done some work on sharing cross borders, and that can also be an area for concern. But in practice, most are willing to consent to broad data sharing. And I don't know if this is controversial, but I guess my final point here is that I don't think that not accommodating all the preferences that might be captured by various kinds of empirical work in policies is equivalent to entering that space of actually violating people's rights. But that's only true if we don't just focus on consent and we move beyond to consider the context and whether we're taking measures that will increase comfort and trust demonstrate respect, and establish trustworthiness, which is different from just getting people to trust us, whether it's warranted or not. And so that includes thinking a lot about de-identification, return of value, care about the access rules, and other aspects of oversight or governance, including that integration of participant voice and vigilance regarding privacy and security. And I haven't really gone into depth about privacy enhancing technologies because that's fairly new, but the Global Alliance, I think, is a wonderful place for piloting some approaches that might do a lot of good in this area in terms of, for example, federated approaches. And I know that's being tried out here in Canada with some success. And then that's especially important if we're aiming for more representative data resources. So we're not just concerned about the perspectives of people who are already inside the research enterprise, but people who maybe have trepidation about it, and if we're inviting them in. And then finally, this set of additional cautions where there are groups that have grounds for greater concern or kinds of especially sensitive research that warrants additional measures to involve and protect. And again, it seems to me that requires a different mindset in terms of a more communal focus in some cases, a much longer time horizon, and in some cases, again, actually ceding control over data resources. And so this is my acknowledgement slide to our whole Solston team, including our fearless leader, Dr. Robert Cook-Deegan. And I'm done, so I'm going to close this and hopefully I can see you all. Let's see.
Thank you so much, Mary. And folks, feel free to put on your cameras so Mary can see you. Any immediate questions from the audience? Okay, well, sometimes they're a little shy, and so they may be formulating a question, but I had one question that I wanted to ask you, Mary, was, so as you, of course, will know that the recent White House announcement from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, it made an announcement on immediate access to articles.
Right.
And I think for me, what's more important and has received less attention is the immediate access to the data underpinning those articles. Will that influence, do you think, availability of the data that you were talking about this morning?
So I think kind of the NIH perspective as a federal agency subject to that general policy is that with their data management and sharing policy, they're already doing what would be required under that announcement. So I guess from that view, it's yes and, it extends it even more broadly, like all agencies, not just NIH, will be implementing that. I think the same considerations in the case of human data about open access versus, non-proprietary access, yes. Open access to human data in the sense that, suddenly we've got to put everything out there for anyone to view. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the announcement itself is sensitive to the special considerations with human participants. And again, I think that would extend to certain groups that have reason to be concerned and may want to exercise greater control. So they're sort of careful to say, yes, this is a very strong commitment to open science. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of, will we actually get to access articles directly versus having to go through TMC, for example? I'm not even sure that's going to change. I think it's still a matter to see. But yeah, to the extent that people wouldn't be subject to the NIH-wide policy, which already, is set to go in place and requires data sharing, then this is a broader sort of document.
Thank you so much. Dorothy Ann, I see you have your hand up. Please proceed.
Hi, can you see me? Great.
Yep.
Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation, Mary. That was really well done, in my opinion. So my question is related to, you alluded to rights. So I'm assuming that the rights you're alluding to are the rights to privacy. And I was just wondering if you saw this as kind of something that would be pivotal to change in relation to how society views research itself. Now that we have this opportunity, this like the ability to actually present ourselves individually at such a unique level, like genetic data is really something that's become just newly available this century, literally from that perspective. So should there be a right for people to determine how this specific type of information is used in the contribution towards the kind of like global research initiatives that we're seeing? Like, we're trying to get people to become more involved in research, to engage and to kind of like take an ownership in research, because it will kind of move the benefits of research and benefits to society so much further. But at the same time, we're kind of taking the rights sort of from the old style of research and attaching it. But maybe we need to move to something completely different in how we allow people to see how this information, this very specific information, could be used. I was just wondering about your thoughts related to that.
So I love that. That's so incredibly rich and so workshop appropriate. Beyond, just the yes or no response. So let me think about that. So I do think it's important to ask people to use their data, and so the consent process is generally important, especially if you're talking about genetic data, and often this is longitudinal data collection, and you are trying to marry the genetic data with other, for example, electronic health record data, although you can de-identify it. So I think it's really important to ask permission. There's data I didn't review that suggests people don't retain, and even like the Global Alliance has provided language that you can put into consent forms related to international data sharing. So again, people are getting that information. There's a lot of research, and what I've heard personally is consistent with this, that people don't always read every line in the consent form, and they certainly don't retain all that information. Do they need to? I'm not so sure if they trust and we're trustworthy. So I'd say part of it is like the rights piece does some work. We need to ask people, that's just basic. I remember reading an interview with someone who said it's like borrowing your sister's bike. And if you do it without asking, she's going to be really mad. But if you ask her, she's probably going to be okay with it. And I think, there's the potential for backlash is if these large projects are launched, even if we think we're being really protective and we don't even ask people's permission, they don't know what's going on. So for both deontological and consequentialist reasons, I think it's important to ask people, is this okay? But then like my other point is, do we have to, like if they say they prefer study by study consent, do we need to, not everybody, do we need to implement that? And I think that's probably, in my opinion, no, as long as we've got these other measures in place. There could still be an argument, I think, for exploring the use of technology. For example, dynamic consent approaches where you give people, and there are a number of research studies ongoing in this area, including I think an important one in Australia, where you kind of make the individual the owner of their data. And you say, okay, are you willing to share this? And you can change your mind, and it's just as easy as going to your dashboard and adjusting your preferences. And I want to see what comes out of that. I'm kind of agnostic. I think in some ways we have choice overload and information overload. And so if we set up a system where people have to manage something new that's pretty complicated, I think the sophisticated users will do just fine, and we're going to lose a lot of people who aren't comfortable with that. And again, I'm might put myself in sophisticated in some ways, but I'm not like a technology native in the same way my children are. And so I might also like drop off if there's a big hassle. People have said they like how 23andMe handles it. I'm not a participant in 23andMe. And you could have an approach where it's kind of people get to make meta level choices. I think this is a long response, but again, I love your question. The Genetic Alliance worked to create a kind of platform where, are you the kind of person that likes to exercise, control at the micro level? Well, then you check this box and we'll generally default to giving you information study by study. Are you the kind of person that likes to make categorical decisions? And we'll let you choose categories. And again, you can change at the meta level, but we're not going to approach you study by study. Are you the kind of person that just likes to give permission at the beginning and then kind of, I'm comfortable, I trust the process, I want to stay out of it, then you can go with this approach. But again, you can always readjust them. So I think those, I don't know if this is responsive to your question, but in terms of like changing our whole approach, there are these proposals out there for really putting more on individuals. And again, from my perspective, I see that as definitely worth testing out, but I also have some concerns about people who would get overwhelmed by the amount of information and the number of choices, even though they wouldn't really object to being a participant in the research if they understood what the protections would be. Does that help? Oh, also, I wanted to mention, again, the idea of privacy enhancing technologies is another way of, people are uncomfortable having their data somehow individual case level data, even if it's de-identified, shared. Would they be, would that carry over to a system where essentially, they're just like have a software that docks and pulls out not individual level information at all, but just the kind of results that the researchers are interested in. I don't know if some of you are involved in those kinds of efforts to use technology to address the privacy and security concerns, but that I think is another area to watch.
Thank you.
And if you wanted to respond, Dorothea, I mean, it sounds like you've thought about these issues, so or not to respond directly to me, but I just would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I was just kind of like, as I was listening to you and you were going through, it just kind of like was percolating. So I can't actually say that I've had like really deep thoughts about this kind of process. I've been involved with research for a number of years, and I sit on the full board REB for our hospital. And so I've seen a lot of consent forms come through with the request to take genetic information. And sometimes it's related to like future research. So can we use your genetic data that we might pull for this study in other research? Sometimes it's directly related to, you can't participate in this particular study unless we get your genetic data, and people have the choice or they don't. And I think maybe my query was driven a little bit by the concerns for the commercialization and the use of the data, which is so inherently a part of us as individuals. And then because the opportunities for commercialization are something beyond what most ordinary people have the concept to imagine, I think that there's a lot that can go on that people maybe, if they don't really understand, and it's too much to expect most people to understand like what can happen with that data and what use it might be put to. And I think that that's kind of where I was kind of thinking with that a little bit. But the demand is becoming almost ubiquitous in so many ways, especially from pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, that's a super interesting point. And I'd say like where I draw, I have issues that I feel strongly about, and then it kind of, it becomes more gray. And like something I feel strongly about is we shouldn't be just turning around and selling people's data. Like I think a lot of people would object to that. I would object to that. Like you collected my data and you're turning it into a proprietary asset for your hospital or institution. And there has been some of that in the US. But beyond that, whether downstream, I care if it my data leads to creation of a new pharmaceutical product or helps with a device development. I think it's a little trickier there. I think a lot of people are distrustful of the pharmaceutical industry, and if prices weren't out of reach, that's where the benefit side comes in. Like, will people like me be able to access the products? I mean, I'm not in principle, I think a lot of people say, objecting to the creation of products, but I'm concerned that they may be out of my reach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion, but we are at the top of the hour, and I need to sort of release people because they may have other things to go to. But I did want to thank you, Mary, for a really wonderful presentation and an invigorating discussion at the end there. So much appreciated for your time and your excellence, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.